didn't start, so I have to. Recording in progress. Great.
It sounds promising.
Yes, it does. Thank you for joining for the conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I noticed your book on Amazon, and I thought that this is a great subject to discuss about.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes. So, first of all, let's start from the beginning, meaning
That's a good
that,
place to start.
yes, of course, and tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your profession, and how did you start writing?
Well, thank you. Good morning. My name is, good afternoon, good day. My name is Doug Wolfberg. I'm an attorney by training, a lawyer, but I have been a Beatles fan virtually my whole life. So that's just been something that's been present in my whole being. And I am also a musician, a very amateur one, but I have been a guitarist, keyboard player, bassist, drummer. I play a little bit of everything. And so I'm also a musician.
Yes. So as you said that the Beatles came early on to your life. What is it that appeals to you about Beatles?
You know, I got my hands on my first Beatles album when I was about 10 years old. So that was in the early mid 1970s. And so the Beatles were already broken up by the time they came into my consciousness. But I don't know, whatever it was, when I got a hold of that record and I started playing it, that appealed to my 10-year-old ears. It just, from that day forward, it's just been a constant presence in my life. For me, it's always been about the creativity, the art, the stories, the melodies, the harmonies, the whole package. And I discovered them in 1975, and they've been a constant presence in my life ever since then.
And for me, it happened in 1987. But still, when I talk about Beatles, um, uh, when people have started listening to them, it actually uh, follows them throughout the whole life, which is a crazy thing to think about. It's only a band, but still, it's very important to people.
That's right. For me, it was a constant presence in my life. All of the milestones, since I was 10 years old, whether it's getting my driver's license and having a cassette player in the car and putting in a Beatles tape, and then, whatever it was, getting married, my wife and I, danced to a Beatles song, and, just all of those milestones throughout my whole life, they've been there.
Yes. So the book is called The Beatles, Fab But True. I just received this. Remarkable stories revealed. What is the genesis of this book?
Well, the genesis is that, being an avid reader of Beatles materials over the decades, I always felt that there were a lot of myths that were swallowing up some of the truths of the Beatles story. And I also felt that there were some really interesting aspects of their story that had fallen through the cracks of history. So for me, I guess maybe my legal training, my research orientation, I just really wanted to dig down for myself into some of these stories. And in doing that, I just discovered these incredibly colorful characters, these, people who intersected with their lives, these just incredible stories that I felt had not really been covered factually or deeply in other things that I had read. And I didn't want these stories to be lost to history, or I wanted the myths to sort of be, pushed to the side. So the facts, which I thought were more interesting than the myths. So the genesis was really trying to tell stories that had either fallen through the cracks or been swallowed up by myths.
Mm. Um, I have been thinking about this, why this has happened, why we are repeating these myths since from the 70s or even from the 60s. And my premise is that I think because authors are usually journalists or writers, they are not really, they don't have a training for history or studying things, and they are more interested in a story than the facts. if you have a nice story, it doesn't matter if it's true or not.
That, I like that explanation, and that could very well be the case. I also found that a lot of the Beatles stories were being told in an echo chamber, meaning that you would find sources on the internet and they would just be citing other sources on the internet.
Yes.
You know, you would sort of try to find out what their sources were, and you'd realize they were all sort of, like you say, telling the same flimsy story without anybody really going back to either primary sources or indisputable factual archives, you know, from records and documents at the time, right? And that was one of the things that I tried to do. Public records, contemporaneous records, contemporaneous news stories. I found that sometimes the telling of a story was a little bit more accurate the first time people were telling it. So if I'd go back and find the interviews from the 1960s and try to read things that were appearing in the media back then, and coupling that with primary source interviews and public records, I tried to put the stories together that way rather than just, you know, Wikipedia. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. Tell us a little bit more about the research. What kind of things did you do? Did you do your own interviews also?
I did. I did do some interviews. I had the opportunity to interview Rod Davis, for example, who was one of the original members of the Quarrymen. In fact, was playing on stage with John the day that he and Paul met, which is a story that is told in one of the chapters in my book. So he was there. He was a primary source, a direct witness. And over the years, I've also had the opportunity to speak with Jeff Emmerich, one of the Beatles recording engineers. I've met Ringo. It's not that I had an extensive interview with him or anything like that, but you know, just being able to talk to primary sources. I've been over to London and Liverpool, spoken with people who were there when many of these stories took place, members of the Best family, for example. Been inside Abbey Road, Studio 2, and had the, you know, good fortune and experience of speaking with people there. So just accumulating interviews and, like I said, a lot of primary history records. For example, there's a chapter about Mal Evans, and there had been stories, you know, repeated on the internet about him over the years. You know, I went and found some sort of primary source records, police reports, for example, things like that, just to try to see what story was being told at the time.
Yes. Have you noticed also that sometimes the stories tend to change throughout the years? I mean, for example, I've noticed that Paul McCartney tells the genesis of some song differently in different eras, which is a funny thing.
It is funny, and you're exactly right, because many of the people who were there tell the stories differently over the years. You know, one example, and maybe the old saying, "If you can remember, you weren't there," right? I mean, these guys were busy living these stories, so you know they weren't writing it down or anything like that while it was happening. One great example of that, there's a story in the book about many Beatle fans know that on their first visit to Hamburg, Germany, you know, it ended sort of ignominiously. You know, George was deported for being underage, and Paul and Pete got deported for setting this condom on fire. And, you know, John went back on his own and Stu Sutcliffe stayed behind. And, you know, it was just this chaotic withdrawal from Germany. But even Paul himself has told the story about this flaming condom differently in different interviews over the decades. So it does sort of make retelling a story like that 60 years later challenging. So sometimes you just have to consume as many interviews and as primary sources as you can. And then just as a writer, you have to sort of say, all right, here's what I think is the realistic telling of that story. When you take all of these interviews and all of these accounts from Pete, from Paul, from, you know, others, and you put it into the blender and you say, here's what I think is the most plausible telling of that story. So there is a degree of informed speculation for some of these stories, but they're all based on factual accounts that were given by the participants.
Mm. In this book, there is 16 chapters, and each of them is like a short story. How did you choose these particular stories to this book?
Yeah, thanks for it's a great question. I felt as a Beatles fan that these were stories that were interesting to me. And I felt that if they were really interesting to me, that they would probably be interesting to loads of other Beatles fans as well, because I consider myself first and foremost a Beatles fan. And, there were some stories that I dug down in that I didn't quite find as interesting, that I didn't use in the book, but these were stories that I just found brought to life these very colorful stories, these very interesting characters. And I thought, if I find them interesting, I think other Beatle fans or even casual fans will just be sort of amazed by how cosmically coincidental some of these stories are.
Yes, I mean, if you would write a fiction story about a band from Liverpool conquering the world and what has happened to them, I think the critics would have said that no, this is not, this can't be real. You know, this is not, this is too fanciful story,
I
too
think
much of a fantasy.
that's especially true because the way you started from Liverpool, right there
Mm.
it would be a fanciful tale, because no popular bands came out of Liverpool, so that
Yes,
right from the start of their story it was implausible.
yes, it did. Um, I have to talk about a few of these stories. Of course, people have to read this because there are lots of these. But for example, in the beginning, you talk about how do you do it song, and there are lots of info there that I didn't know. And uh, let's discuss about this first to be single. So the story is a little bit different than that has been told actually.
Yeah, that's right. So the Beatles' first single, which ended up being "Love Me Do," George Martin, their producer, originally wanted it to be a composition by a composer named Mitch Murray, and the song was called "How Do You Do It." Now that song was released on Anthology, so I think many Beatle fans are familiar with it. But what they might not be as familiar with is the story of how close the Beatles came to being recording artists who merely recorded other people's music, right? And George Martin, contrary to popular belief, did not sort of discover the Beatles and find some essential quality and sign them and made them famous. The Beatles were sort of foisted on George Martin by a publishing subsidiary of EMI Records. So back then, publishing really held a large role in the music industry. It still does, but back then it was, I think, even had a greater impact than it does now. And the publishers really controlled a lot of what ended up on records. And producers would go to what was called Tin Pan Alley, and that was where all the composers had their offices. And they would listen to pitches of these songs, usually on these tack pianos. So that's sounded like tin pans banging. That's why they always called it Tin Pan Alley. And the producers would sort of shop for songs. And Mitch Murray was an up and coming composer. In fact, this was his first hit, really, that he had written. And George Martin heard it, liked it, and told the Beatles they were going to record it. They did record it, but they made a stand in favor of their own compositions, which was really one of the most incredible stories of the Beatles, because they had not yet recorded any hits. They had not had any records, singles, or albums out. They had no clout whatsoever. And to sort of make a stand in it up to their record producer, who was, the god of all of these things back then, and say, we don't want to release that, we want to record our own material, is really one of the most crucial moments for the Beatles, I think. To turn down what became a sure #1 hit, because How Do You Do It did become a #1 hit for Jerry and the Pacemakers. But to make that stand when they had no clout to make it with is really one of the most incredible stories, I think, of the Beatles' recording career, to be sure.
Yes, and of course, we look at things from our perspective and we know how things work nowadays. But in the 60s, it was totally different. The whole publishing, whole music world, how the uh, artists were seen, how it was viewed by the public or by the record companies, it was totally different than now.
That's right. Excuse me. The recording artists were sort of, the red light would go on, and the producer would point at them, and they'd be, required to just play, and then they would have to go out and play shows and concerts to promote the music. But it was all, that's right, pretty much the domain of the publishers and the producers, and the recording artists were just sort of the vehicle to get those songs out there, more so than the focus of the music business. And the Beatles really, I think, and the story I tell in the book is how the Beatles really helped to shift that power to the composers and the performers, and away from the publishers and the producers.
Yes, it's very interesting that how we look at artists now is something that Beatles actually started. They started creating their own music. They started making their own films, own companies, everything. And now for us artists who want to build their own company or something like that, it's like normal thing. But then it was absolutely, everything was absolutely new. They were, making the way to this day.
That's right, on almost every front, not only on the publishing, the business side. Some of that they were feeling their way. I mean, they didn't always make great decisions, but they had no guidebook, they had no template, no roadmap. As you say, same thing is true of merchandising, the publishing, starting of companies, management. They really did blaze a trail on a lot of these issues, as you say.
Yes, indeed. There are also in this book there are also stories which are more modern than actually some of the stories come very closely to our days. For example, you talk about a battle of the apples here, but I think that story is also very important. That how the computer company Apple and the record company Apple were fighting each other and tried to cope with each other. And nowadays, when everything is almost like settled, now we can enjoy the fruits from that tree.
Well, that was a very tumultuous period because, and you're right, the story, that does bring us right up into the digital age, and we still look at the Beatles' influence and their history, up through the current and the digital age. But the story in the book about the Battle of the Apples, Apple Corps, the Beatles company, was started in the 1960s. And really became their main business vehicle after their manager, Brian Epstein, died. The power sort of shifted from NEMS, his company, over to the Beatles' own company, Apple. And Apple Computer, there's various stories about how their name was inspired. Some said they wanted to be first in the phone book. But, Steve Jobs in his lifetime made no secret of the fact that he was a huge fan of the Beatles. He modeled much of his business and much of his approach after the Beatles, was very inspired by the Beatles. And it was sort of then unfortunate that there ended up being significant litigation. And there were several rounds of litigation between Apple Corps, the Beatles, and Apple Computer. And, the first few lawsuits, Apple Corps, the Beatles company, really prevailed because their domain was physical music, records. And the use of the name Apple by the computer company, there were some settlements where they were allowed to continue to do that. But then as music shifted more digitally, Apple Computer had a different vision that music didn't just exist on physical media like records and tapes. And, with CDs and the advent of digital music, Apple Computer realized that music could be delivered digitally and consumed digitally. And as Apple's market capitalization grew and they became a behemoth, with a market value, 100 times, if not more, than what the Beatles company is, the power really shifted. And in the last round of litigation, Apple Computer prevailed so thoroughly that they now own the intellectual property of the name Apple Corps, and the Beatles company, which came first, actually licenses that name from Apple Computer now. So it really ended up sort of being a complete shift away from physical music records in favor of this digital powerhouse. So the story I tell is how this utopian vision, because Apple Corps was intended to be this egalitarian company where people could come and submit their tapes and get a record deal, and be open to be accessible to the masses, now ends up sort of being, the name is owned by this modern day tech behemoth. So it was really a transition, and the chapter in the book talks about how that balance of power shifted from sort of physical media over to digital music, and how the Beatles were really at the center of that.
Yes. And when you gave these figures, how much everything is worth, all these millions and billions, I actually realized that they could have been this case that Apple could have bought the Beatles. I mean, they had so much power, they had so much money, they could have done it, but they didn't because of Steve Jobs' respect for the band.
Right. I think at the end of the day, there was a regret on the part of Apple Computer that it did end up in litigation with, what were their the Beatles were heroes of theirs. But business is business. And yeah, certainly Apple, had enough capital to swallow the Beatles company or just about any company. Now, I'm not saying that the Beatles would have sold their whole catalog or their whole business interest to Apple Computer. The Beatles have famously resisted, I won't say all commercialization of their music and image, because they're certainly commercial, but they have not been commercialized in the way that other bands have been, that's for sure.
Yes, that's right. From these 16 stories, do you have a favorite story?
That's a great question. One of the stories I love to tell for my sort of elevator pitch is connected to the image on the inside cover. So this is it's I don't know how colorful it's appearing on the Zoom camera, but this is a very colorful painting, and it happens to be the only painting that all four Beatles did together. And there's a chapter in the book where I talk about the Beatles' final tour, world tour in 1966, which for the first and only time took them to Japan. Now, the Beatles were scheduled to play at the Budokan, and nowadays we don't think twice about concerts at the Budokan. Cheap Trick at the Budokan was a breakthrough album, one of the most popular live albums in history. But in 1966, no Western artists had played at the Budokan, which was seen as a sacred site. So there were protests swirling throughout Tokyo when the Beatles landed there in the summer of 1966. And the promoter who had booked them to play in Japan, a promoter named Tats Nagashima, who had been educated in the West, knew Western culture, knew Western music, booked them to come to Japan, booked them to play at the Budokan. And then when sort of the conservative circles of Japan society started protesting, the president of Japan appeared at a protest against the Beatles' performance at the Budokan. But what was very curious is that there were three other notable Japanese citizens who joined him at the protest, one of whom was Tats Nagashima, who was the promoter who booked the Beatles to play in Japan. Now he's showing up at a protest. So on one hand, he was promoting the concert, pocketing the money, and on the other hand, he was trying to sort of curry favor with the Japanese government by protesting the desecration of the Budokan. But for whatever reason, whether it was it felt guilty, or for whatever reason, when the Beatles got to Japan, because of these protests, they were locked in their suite in the Tokyo Hilton for 3 days. Tats Nagashima brought them a canvas and some paints and cameras to just help them pass the time. And during the 3 days while they were locked in this suite at the Tokyo Hilton, they almost obsessively worked on this painting, the four Beatles together. And there's pictures in the book of them actually doing this joint painting. And while they were doing this painting, they stuck a table lamp in the middle of the canvas so they could see what they were doing. And folks can see that big white circle in the middle of the painting is where that lamp was sitting. And each Beatle signed their name in that circle adjacent to their contribution. This is the only work of visual art, the only painting all four Beatles ever did together. And it was done while they were in lockdown in Japan, while these protests were swirling around them. I just found that story fascinating, not only because of sort of the duplicity of the promoter, but the fact that the Beatles could just find serenity amidst all this chaos while just creating something. They passed the time by just being creative and being content to create while all of this madness was happening around them. I just find that to be just a lovely story.
That's how actually they made most of their songs, in the hotel rooms, in the
Creating
bathrooms.
it amidst the, yeah, right, that's right. They had to find time wherever they could. They would be in a hotel room or on a tour bus or in a van, and just trying to compose and create whenever they could, because the demands on their time were so incredible. But it's just so clear how much they loved to create. And I just think that story about the painting just tells us just all of these good things, just these lovely things about their creativity.
Yes, and that story is actually one of the ones that I never heard. I never read it from anywhere, and I think that's really one of the most fascinating stories that you have brought to this book. And one thing is that when you read these stories, they are very complex, very complicated things. There are many things that you kind of ask yourself that what if she would have not won the horse race? What if? And on and on and on. You just realize that Beatles were constantly moving towards the greatness, but it wasn't said that it was going to happen.
That's right. And the very first chapter that you talked about deals with a horse race that helped sort of give birth to the Beatles. Pete Best's mother had bet all of her money on a race in the Epsom Derby, and she bet it on a horse called Never Say Die because she liked the name. But the horse was a long shot. It had 33-1 odds. Well, lo and behold, this horse wins. With her money, she buys this big house in the suburbs in Liverpool and puts a club in the basement so her teenage kids, Rory and Pete, will have someplace safe to go and listen to music and get together with their friends. Well, that club was the Casbah Coffee Club. And at a time in the late 50s, when the Beatles were like, every kid who ever picks up a musical instrument thinks, well, maybe I can do this for a living. Maybe I'll become a successful musician. That's never preordained, right? It's not, there's no certainty that's going to happen. And in fact, for most musicians, it won't happen. So in the late 50s, when the Beatles were faced with the decision, do they want to go to school and get sensible jobs and work at the factory or do whatever, or try to make a living doing music, they needed gigs to keep them together. And at a time when they were kicking around with no prospects, the opening of this club gave them a paid gig and really helped to keep these then still amateur musicians together and give them the impetus to try to do this as a career. And you're so right that some of these stories were so precarious almost that, the Beatles story could have turned out so differently at many pivotal points in their career.
Yes, but of course we're glad that none of these what ifs didn't happen.
So thankful.
Yes. Uh, so, Doug, I think this is your first book about the Beatles. Will there be a second one?
First book, yep, about the Beatles.
What about second one?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I did stockpile some stories that I didn't use in this book, that I think would make good, compelling stories for a sequel. So we'll see. I'm very gratified by the reception of this book, and it certainly is planting the seed for maybe a second volume.
Sounds good, because I find this book really beautiful. It has lots of wonderful pictures, also pictures that I've never seen before. You have taken some pictures here also, and it's really well written. And I recommended this to my wife. She's not really interested in Beatles, so start here because there are nice stories in here.
Well, thank you. And first of all, the pictures, that was something my vision for the book was that it contained a lot of pictures that weren't commonly seen, pictures of the Beatles. So I appreciate your comments on that. And then secondly, I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who have read the book who aren't hardcore Beatle fans, but wanted to learn a little bit more and use this book sort of as their introduction to the Beatles. So I think whether you are a hardcore lifelong Beatles fan, I think there are things in there that will make you scratch your head and raise your eyebrows. But I think even for people who are new to the Beatles or were only casual fans over the years, I think they'll find some of these stories very interesting too. So I appreciate you saying that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doug, of your time. I think our time is up, and I recommend everybody to get this book. It's available on Amazon, for example. And thank you for your time. And I will send you a link when I'm done editing, etc.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.